I'm pleased to have Dr. Stallman here. He is the author of Emacs, GCC, GDB, and the GNU public license. And
No, it's the GNU General Public License.
Yes, we have to be very careful with words around him, as we know. And thus the founder of the free software movement. And happy to have you here, and I'm looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
I'd like to start with two requests. First, if you take photos of me, please do not put them in Facebook. Facebook is a surveillance engine. And if you put a photo of other people in Facebook, Facebook uses that photo to do more surveillance of those people. It asks users to say the names of the people that appear in the photograph, so Facebook's databases get more information about those people thanks to your photo. Well, we could question whether putting photos of your friends in Facebook is really the way to treat a friend. But that doesn't directly affect me. My request is don't put photos of me in Facebook. Don't help Facebook do surveillance of me. Second, if you make a recording of this talk and you want to distribute copies, please do so only in the formats that are favorable to free software. These are the OGG formats and WebM. So no MP3, no MPEG-2, no MPEG-4, no Real Player, no Windows Media Player, no QuickTime, and certainly no Flash. And also, please put on this recording the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this work is a statement of my own personal views. So, this is not a talk about free software. This talk responds to a question people have sometimes asked me at the end of a talk about free software. So, in order for it to make sense, I better start by telling you briefly about free software. What is free software? Well, with software there are just two possibilities. Either the users control the program or the program controls the users. In order for the users to have effective control of the program, they need certain freedoms. So we call that case free software. It's free in the sense of freedom, not price. So it's frei, not kostenlos. Well, it doesn't have to be kostenlos. That's a detail we're not concerned with. We're only concerned with freedom and community. So in order for the users to have effective control, they need certain specific freedoms. These are the four essential freedoms that define free software, that are the criterion for free software. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so it does your computing as you wish. And this includes the freedom to actually use your modified version. So if you're using a device that allows the manufacturer to publish modified versions and they'll run, but your version it won't run, we call that a tyrant device, and that's not free software. That executable is not free software. Maybe it's made from free source code, but if the executable won't let you change it, then it's not free. Well, these two freedoms give users individual control over the program, but individual control is not enough. First of all, there are millions of computer users that don't know how to program. They don't know how to exercise freedom 1. So if all they had was individual control and they don't know how to exercise it, they don't have control. In any case, even programmers can't one programmer can't do everything. There's so much free software in the world that no one user could possibly study and master all that source code, let alone make all the changes she might want to make, because that's more work than one human being can do. So we also need collective control. For collective control, there are two other freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help others. That's the freedom to redistribute exact copies when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community. That's the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. These two freedoms give us collective control, which means that any group of people or group of users that want to maintain a version of the program can do so, and that group has control of that version. So this way, the people who are not programmers, by the users who are not programmers, can join a group with some programmers in it of people that want the same thing, and the ones who are programmers will develop the program to do what they want, and the others stay in the group because it's going in the direction they like. And if they don't like what that group is doing, they can join a different group that is changing the program in a different way. So this way, all users benefit from collective control over the program. But if the users don't have these freedoms, then it's not free software. That means the users don't control the program. Instead, the program controls the users. But there's always some entity that controls the program, and through it subjugates the users of that program. Because this entity, by controlling the program, exercises power over those users. A non-free program is an instrument of unjust power. That's why non-free software is an injustice, why it should not exist. So the objective of the free software movement is all software should be free so that all the users of software can be free. So we invite you to escape from non-free software and come live with us in the free world that we have built. So this is why in 1984 I started developing the GNU operating system. The computer isn't usable without an operating system. It won't do anything. You've got to have an operating system to make it good for something. Back then, all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary, so it was impossible to buy a computer and use it in freedom. I wanted to make that possible, and the only way I could see was to write an operating system. Of course, I asked other people to help, and by 1992, we had it almost finished, and only one component was missing. And a Mr. Torvalds released a free program called Linux to do that job. So Linux essentially filled the last gap in the GNU system. Here was the GNU system, not quite finished. There was this missing component. Linux fit in there, making a system which was basically GNU, but also contained Linux. And then the people who put them together, they were mainly connected with Linux. And they perceived all the rest of the system, which was GNU, as a small add-on for Linux. And they started talking about the whole system as a Linux system, which is not fair. So please call the system GNU/Linux or GNU+Linux. We are the system's principal developer. Please give us equal mention. So once I started giving a lot of speeches about free software, people started asking me whether these ideas apply to anything other than software. Well, often they would ask, what about hardware? Should hardware be free too? And they meant this as wise guys, and it wasn't supposed to be a serious idea, it was just supposed to annoy me. But let's look and see whether hardware, physical objects, can be free in the same sense. Well, look, it would mean, can they carry the same four freedoms? Well, freedom 0 is the freedom to use the program as you wish. With physical objects, that would be the freedom to use the object as you wish. Well, if you buy a physical object, in general, you are free to use it as you wish. You've got freedom 0. Okay, that's good. What about freedom 1, the freedom to study and change the source code so the program does your computing as you wish? Well, physical objects normally don't have source code. I don't think this was made from source code, or this either, or this bag, or this clock. So, well, what do? We have to adapt freedom 1. It could be the freedom to study and change the object itself to make it do what you wish when you use it. And you've got that freedom, at least with occasional nasty limitations. But in general, you have that freedom, except that the ability to actually modify most physical objects is rather limited. Now, since this is made of wood, there actually is the potential to modify this in a number of ways. But those chairs which are made, I don't know, plastic or metal, those are much harder to change. And a computer chip is impossible to change. If you tried, you would burn it out. It would be destroyed. And this is not because somebody's being nasty. It's just the nature of chips, that they're full of these tiny circuits, and there's no way to change that. So that's just life. But the result is freedom 1 is meaningless for those chips. As for freedom 2, the freedom to redistribute exact copies, well, there are no copiers in general for physical objects outside science fiction. There's some interesting science fiction about what it would be like to have these copiers, but in real life we don't have them, so the issue is not worth thinking about, except as speculation about the future. But as a practical issue, we don't need to worry about it. And likewise, freedom 3, if I made a modified version of this podium, which we could call a pseudo-podium, you still would have no copiers, so you wouldn't be able to distribute copies of your modified podium. So those two freedoms, they just don't apply at all. So the result is there's not much of a real political question about these freedoms for physical objects, but there are other things for which these 4 freedoms are possible, namely copies of published works that you might have in your computer, and with your computer you can use them, maybe you can change them, you can copy them and distribute them with or without changes. So these freedoms are possible, which means the question of whether you're allowed to do them is a real question with real consequences. Now, if you are denied some of these freedoms, for the most part, what denies them is copyright law. There are starting to be other methods. Well, for software, there have always been other ways they could be denied. But if we're not talking about software, since the question is how do these ideas extend to things other than software, for the most part, it's just copyright law that might deny you these freedoms. So we can pose the same question from the other side by saying, what should copyright law say about your use of your copies of published works? Now, to consider this question, it's useful to look at the history of copyright, which is connected with the history of copying technology. Now, why is the technology relevant to a question about what's right or wrong? Basic ethical principles can't be affected by changes in technology. They're too deep to be reached by such superficial things. But when we apply our principles to a specific issue, we do it by looking at what options you might have and their consequences, and we apply our principles to those consequences. Well, a change in the context might alter the consequences of a possible action. They could make the outcome better or worse than it would have been before. And that can affect our moral judgment. For instance, if we could reliably resurrect the dead, then murder wouldn't be so bad. The judge would say, "You killed him, you will pay for his new body." Bang. Of course, in the United States, we would all need uninsured killer insurance in case we were killed by someone with no money to pay to resurrect us. But in civilized countries, the National Health Service would take care of it. So let's look at the history of copying technology and copyright. Copying began in the ancient world. It was done by reading one copy of a book and writing another. Very slow. But this technology had certain other interesting consequences. First of all, there was essentially no economy of scale. To make 10 copies would take you 10 times as much time and work and material and so on as making one copy. Second, it required no particular skill other than literacy itself. You had to know how to read and write, but that's all you had to know. And finally, it required no equipment other than the equipment for reading and writing. The result was that copies of any given book were made in a decentralized way. Wherever there was one copy and somebody wanted to make another, he would. In the ancient world, there was nothing like copyright, nothing whatsoever. If you had a copy of a book and you wanted to copy it, no one said you couldn't do that, except if the local potentate didn't like the book, in which case he might do horrible things to you. But that was not copyright. That was something closely related, namely censorship. Well, things went along that way for thousands of years, and then there was a tremendous advance in copying technology, namely the printing press. The printing press made copying much more efficient, but in a non-uniform way. Here's the situation in the ancient world: mass production copying and one-off copying equally slow. In the age of the printing press, though, mass production copying got a lot more efficient, but one-off copying did not benefit at all, because the fastest way to do that was by hand. You see, with the printing press, it takes a lot of work to set the type. Once you have done that, you can fairly quickly make many identical copies, much faster than you could write them, at least. So this was an inherent economy of scale. It only made sense to use the printing press for mass production. Second, the printing press and the type were expensive equipment that most literate people didn't own. And they also didn't know how to use them. I suppose most of them could have learned. It wasn't rocket science, but it was a skill. It was a trade. And it wasn't obvious right off the bat what you had to do. You had to learn. And most people who were literate didn't learn that. They were doing something else. So the result was a centralized system of producing copies. Copies of a book were made in a few places and then transported to where someone wanted to buy them. Copyright began in the age of the printing press. Copyright, I think today's copyright systems go back to the system in England, which was started in 1553 as a system of censorship, specifically censorship of Protestantism under Queen Mary, who did horrible things to Protestants. So if you wanted to, according to this law, if you wanted to publish a book in England, you had to get permission from the state, which was given in the form of a perpetual monopoly for one publisher. Well, this went along for a while, but then in the 1680s, the censorship was no longer desired, and the system was allowed to lapse. The publishers demanded their monopoly back, but what they got was somewhat different. Under the Statute of Anne, the authors were given a monopoly, I believe, for 14 years, but they could renew it once if they were still alive after 14 years. They could get another 14 years of monopoly. And the idea developed that copyright was a system to encourage authorship by directing some income towards the authors. When the US Constitution was written, of course, the authors were thinking of, the drafters of the Constitution were thinking about this. There was a proposal that authors be guaranteed a monopoly over their works. This was rejected. Instead, the US Constitution permits optionally a copyright system, otherwise it would be unconstitutional, and it says that this system would be to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. In other words, if there is a copyright system, the justification for it is not in the interests of the authors, let alone the publishers, rather in the public benefit that results from writing and publication. And the Constitution also says it has to last for a limited time. The publishers are working overtime trying to get us to forget that decision. However, in the age of the printing press, copyright operated as an industrial regulation on publishers. In fact, that's why it seemed like a natural system to adopt, because it was an industrial regulation on publishers, controlled by the authors, but set up to provide benefits to the general public. As a result, it was mostly uncontroversial, easy to enforce, and arguably beneficial for society. It was uncontroversial because if you were not publishing, it didn't restrict you. And therefore, you had nothing to even possibly complain about. Second, it was easy to enforce because it only had to be enforced against publishers. And it's easy to find out who's publishing a book. You go to a bookstore and you say, where did these copies come from? It didn't require invading everybody's home, everybody's computer, or everybody's internet connection. And finally, it was arguably beneficial for society because according to the conceptual basis of copyright in the US, what copyright is a trade between the public and authors. The public trades away part of its natural right to copy anything at all, and in exchange receives other benefits. Now, was this a beneficial trade or a harmful one? The public had no way to copy books. If you were copying books in more than a tiny quantity, you were publishing. You weren't an ordinary reader. So the ordinary readers had no way to infringe copyright. So what they were trading away was a theoretical right that they couldn't actually exercise, worth nothing to them directly. So why not trade it away for something else, namely having people write more, which is of some benefit to the general public. So if we were still in the age of the printing press, I probably wouldn't be complaining about or criticizing copyright law. But the age of the printing press is gradually transforming and shading into the age of the computer networks, another advance in copying technology, which once again makes copying more efficient in a non-uniform way. Here's the situation in the age of the printing press. Mass production copying, very efficient. One-off copying, slow. Well, with digital technology, we get this. They both benefit, but it's one-off copying that benefits the most. It's now almost as efficient in general as mass production copying. In some cases, they're equally efficient, in some cases, not quite. But in general, they're pretty close now. For instance, one-off CDs are more expensive and less robust than mass-produced CDs. But one-off CDs are cheap enough and useful enough that hundreds of millions of people can make them. So we have returned to a situation more like the ancient world, except everything's easier. And this means that copyright doesn't fit anymore. Copyright's effect has been totally transformed by this change in its context. Because nowadays the publishers want to apply the copyright restrictions to ordinary citizens that just use the works. They're not publishers in any real sense. But nowadays, thanks to the benefit of digital technology, they can copy, they can redistribute, and they want to do so because it's so useful and so helpful to society when they do. But the publishers don't want people to be able to get the benefit of digital technology, so they are fighting to stop it, and they have totally changed the effect of copyright law. It's no longer an industrial regulation on publishers controlled by authors set up to benefit the public. Now it's an onerous restriction on the general public, effectively controlled most of the time by publishers in the name of the authors. That's a completely different thing. Copyright in the age of the printing press was uncontroversial, easy to enforce, and arguably beneficial. Copyright in the digital age is none of those things. It's now exceedingly controversial. So controversial that the citizens fed up with these restrictions are forming political parties to fight against them. It's no longer easy to enforce. To enforce copyright today requires invading everybody's lives. And it's no longer possibly beneficial. Now it's simply oppressive and exploitative. So the justification for copyright has gone. Copyright and this is even if the words of copyright law were the same as they were 60 years ago, their effect would be totally different now. Their effect 60 years ago was useful and uncontroversial. Their effect in today's context is harmful. But the words of copyright law have not stayed the same. What would a democratic government that represents its people do to copyright law given the circumstances of today? It would reduce copyright power. It would say, we traded away on behalf of the citizens some of their natural rights, which in the past they couldn't exercise, and that was okay in the past. But now they can exercise these rights. They deserve to have these rights. These rights must not be taken away from them. So the government would reduce copyright power, restoring to the public the rights that the public needs and demands. We can measure the sickness of democracy today by the tendency of states to do the exact opposite. They're making copyright law more restrictive than it was in the past. This occurs in two dimensions. There's the dimension of time and the dimension of breadth. First, the dimension of time. How long should copyright last? Copyright is being extended all around the world under the pressure of publishers that make one-sided, invalid arguments. The US has been the worst at this. The US has extended copyright several times in the past few decades. The last time was in 1998 with the Mickey Mouse Copyright Act. Not its official name, but that's what it really was. They extended copyright by 20 more years for all works, both past and future. And this was supposedly to serve the constitutionally mandated purpose of promoting the progress of science and the useful arts. But how in the world do you promote this by extending copyright on works that were written before this law? How can they encourage the now dead artists of the 20s and 30s to write more back then by changing the law now? They'd need a time machine. And if they have one, they haven't used it. Because our history books don't record that artists in 1923, when they discovered how their copyrights would be extended several times, including 1998, set to work with renewed vigor. Why don't they use their time machine and give us more beloved classics? Well, extending copyright for future works could theoretically encourage someone to make more works, but only if the artists are crazy. And although, of course, there's a sort of myth that artists are crazy, it's mostly not true. Basically, nobody rational would have his decisions affected at all, because in economic terms, the discounted present value of 20 more years of copyright starting 50 years after you die is so small it won't affect your decisions about what to do. And any business that claimed that 75 years of copyright for a work made by the employees was not enough, that they needed 95 years, should have been challenged to support this claim with projected balance sheets for 75 years in the future, which of course no business has. In fact, all those arguments were complete bullshit. The reason that law was passed is that various companies that had lucrative monopolies that were scheduled to end soon didn't want those monopolies to end. For instance, Disney was aware that the copyright on the first films in which Mickey Mouse appeared were going to expire soon unless they did something about it. So that's why we call it the Mickey Mouse Copyright Act, because Disney, among others, paid to get an extended monopoly on the appearance of Mickey Mouse. Well, they're not going to be satisfied with 20 more years. The movie companies have already said they want perpetual copyright, but they're not powerful enough to change the US Constitution, at least not yet. So what can they do? They came up with a clever plan, which we refer to as perpetual copyright on the installment plan, which means that every 20 years they extend copyright 20 more years. So at any given time, theoretically, any given work will go into the public domain at a certain date. But that date is like tomorrow, it never comes. By the time you get there, they will have postponed it 20 more years. That's what they intend to do. We're going to have a fight on our hands in a few years. So, the US is not the only place where copyright is being extended. Canada is now doing it, which is a really sad thing. And Europe extended the length of copyright on sound recordings which is a bad thing. They still go around doing this all around the world. The worst country where copyright is concerned is Mexico. In Mexico, copyright lasts until 100 years after the author's death. So you could see a work that was written by somebody who died before you were born, and that work will never be in the public domain during your life. I can't imagine what justification they think they have for that absurd length. But in fact, 50 years after the author dies is far too long anyway. But what about the dimension of breadth? Which uses of a work would copyright cover? Well, in the age of the printing press, it was never supposed that copyright should cover all uses of a published work. Within the space of all the possible uses of a published work, some of them were put under copyright as an exception, and the rest remained things that people were free to do. However, the publishers have recognized that digital technology gives them the opportunity to seize total control, to create and impose on people a pay-per-view universe. And they're doing this through malicious technology, specifically digital restrictions management, or DRM. These are the malicious features in programs and in hardware designed specifically to restrict their users. For decades now, technology companies have been turning our technology into handcuffs for its users. We first saw this, the general public first saw this with DVDs. The movie on a DVD can be stored in an encrypted format that was initially secret. The reason it was secret was so that the DVD conspiracy could require anyone that wanted to manufacture DVD players to join the conspiracy, which required promising that the company would, first of all, keep it secret, and second of all, design those DVD players to restrict their users just like all the other DVD players. That's why there's no effective competition in this. They all restrict people the same way. So, that worked for a while, but then people figured out what the format was and developed a free program to play a DVD. So you could actually buy a DVD and play it in your computer using free software. So the movie companies didn't like that, so they purchased a law in the US called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which imposed censorship on software. The US practices censorship of software. Specifically, that program, that free program that made it possible to play a DVD is censored in the US because it sets people free. And the US government is on the side of business against the people. It doesn't want people to be free. However, the program remained easy to get. Now, I wish I could say that this form of unjust law were limited to the US. However, the European Union in 2003 adopted a directive requiring similar censorship. And in France, even possessing a copy of a program to break digital handcuffs is a crime punished with imprisonment. However, France made an exception for DVDs. That software is not forbidden in France. I'm not sure why, but it's a good thing. I won't complain. But they should get rid of that law, though. They shouldn't ban any of these programs. Now, in Finland, an interesting thing happened. a court, the law would have applied to and censored that software, but a court ruled that the software is so commonly available that the law didn't apply to it. They ruled that DVDs encryption is not an effective means of technical restriction of the users, so the law doesn't apply. Well, that's nice. Maybe every one of these schemes, if it gets broken and enough people have the software, that it will become legal in Finland. Or maybe the companies will purchase a change in that law. It's something that people will have to fight against. But even so, even despite these laws, the software is still easy to find. So the movie companies developed another system of encryption called AACS. And the AACS conspiracy is quite arrogant in imposing its demands on manufacturers. For instance, starting either in 2011 or 2013, I can't remember which, analog video outputs are prohibited. So either they were prohibited a year ago or they'll be prohibited in a year. They call this closing the analog hole. Let me show you a couple of the analog holes they wish they could close. So they are taking control of the technology that's available to us and making it malicious. Of course, this has to be done through non-free software. You see, with free software, the users control the program, and if it had a malicious feature, they would take it out. So anybody that wants to use software to control people, to restrict them, has to make it non-free. That means there are two injustices here at once. There's the deeper injustice of the foundational injustice of non-free software. And then this injustice gives them the opportunity to do another injustice, namely put in the malicious feature of restricting what people can do with the data in their computers, a specific malicious feature. In general, you find lots of malicious features in non-free software. There are three kinds. There are spy features, there are digital handcuffs or DRM, and there are backdoors. And widely used non-free programs have these. For instance, Windows has all three. Mac OS, we know, has digital handcuffs. We don't know if it has a backdoor or spy features. The iThings, which are Apple's newer computers, they have all three. They have the tightest digital handcuffs ever, because Apple actually took control over the installation of programs. Users are not even free to install whatever applications they want. So Apple is practicing censorship, and it's very arbitrary and nasty censorship too. And it has a backdoor. Flash Player has a surveillance feature and digital restrictions management. The Amazon swindle, well, I'll talk about that in a little bit. And most portable phones have the software in them, even if users can't change them, if they're so-called feature phones instead of smartphones, a company can remotely install changes in that software, and that's a backdoor. In fact, it's a universal backdoor, meaning any malicious feature that's not in the phone today could be remotely installed tomorrow, just as in Windows. That has a universal backdoor too. And this has been used to remotely convert portable phones into listening devices. So malicious features are quite common in non-free software because the developer is aware of the power it exercises over the users, and that's a big temptation to take advantage of that power by putting things in the software to push the users down even further. So in particular, those that implement digital restrictions management almost always do it in non-free software so that they can stop the users from fixing the intentional malicious feature. So eventually AACS was broken too. Someone published a free program that could decrypt the AACS encryption, but it was useless because you had to know the key to do anything with it. And the key was secret. And then a few times, I'm told, people have found these keys and published them. And the government tried to suppress the publication of the keys. The first one of these keys that I saw, it was in a photo of two cute puppies with 32 hex digits above. Why, I thought, would anyone combine these hex digits with the puppies? Maybe that those digits are a key that the publisher isn't supposed to know, and it was put together with the puppies, figuring that people would save the photo because the puppies were cute, and this way the key would be protected from attempts to wipe it out. And that's indeed what it was. But the thing is, they set it up so they can change the key fairly often. So that was not a permanent victory. We have not permanently defeated AACS. And the Blu-ray discs, which use AACS, also have another level of digital handcuffs. They don't all use it, but it can be used, which involves running a program on a specific platform and measuring the timing so that if you're simulating it, it's very hard to imitate that platform and make the program say yes. And if the program doesn't say yes, it refuses to play, and somehow that's hooked into decoding it somehow. And this is something that has not been broken in free software. So it's a mistake to assume that digital handcuffs are no problem because we'll always break the schemes. We're so clever. Well, they can hire clever and amoral people who will implement digital handcuffs. Underestimating the enemy is a recipe for defeat. We must not underestimate our enemies. We must fight them and defeat them. So, that's where things stand in video, except that we're starting to see video distributed over the internet, and there it makes it even harder to break the DRM because they can change it at any minute. So be especially on guard against over-the-net distribution schemes such as Netflix. A friend invited me to watch a movie that she would get into her computer using Netflix, and I said, no, I won't do it. There are some things that are so outrageous, I won't even watch. Of course, I wouldn't have the non-free Netflix software on my own computer, but this was her computer. Right? I don't insist that other people not have non-free software on their computers, but this particular non-free software is so nasty, I said, count me out. I'm not going to watch through that. And unfortunately, DRM is not limited to video. We've also seen DRM in music. Starting around 12 years ago, we saw things that looked like compact discs, but they were not written according to the specs for compact discs. So we called them corrupt discs. After all, people thought of them as CDs, but they were a different kind of CD. So they were written basically writing the tracks in a funny way, so the idea was that audio players would read them, but computers wouldn't. Although someone told me that he managed to read them successfully using CD Paranoia, which is a program that basically tries to handle broken CDs and read them anyway. So anyway, people made lists of these corrupt discs to warn other people to reject them. In some European countries, you could tell that something was a corrupt disk because it wasn't allowed to carry this compact disc logo, since it was not written according to the standard, after all. So that was quite helpful in rejecting them. I gave a speech on this topic once in Spain, where I had been invited by an agency of the regional government. And afterwards, as such governments tend to do, they gave me books of beautiful photos from their region and records of music from the region. And one of them was a musician I'd heard of, although I can't remember his name now. So I wanted to listen, but fortunately, before I opened the package, I noticed the symbol copy control. This disc can be played on Windows and Macintosh systems. Meaning, as far as I could tell, not with free software. So I didn't open it. Instead, I gave it back and said, "Here you see the face of the enemy. Please return this to the store so that they don't get to keep your money." And I've never heard that music, which is a pretty small sacrifice after all. I mean, how could you not make a tiny sacrifice like that for the cause of freedom? So, I've never heard that music, and maybe I never will. Sony had a clever and nasty scheme for corrupt discs. They said, instead of writing the tracks in a squiggly way, instead we'll write the tracks in a normal way, but put a program on the disc so that if it's put into a computer, the program will run. And this program, which is a lot like a virus, would take control of the operating system. Okay, that's one crime already. And then it would modify the system so as to restrict what people could do with the music on the disc. But that's not all it did. It also modified another part of the system to disguise its presence so that the command that was supposed to show you what was installed in the system would fail to mention it. And it modified another command that was supposed to be able to delete that stuff so it wouldn't actually delete it. This program is known as a rootkit. It's basically the way one takes control of an operating system. Well, that was a serious crime. They could have gone to prison for years for that. But it wasn't the only serious crime they committed. You see, some of the code that they were using in this was copied from a program that had a free program that was released in particular under the GNU General Public License. Now, the GNU General Public License is a particular kind of free software license called copyleft. And what does that mean? That means when it gives you Freedom 2 and Freedom 3, the freedom to distribute exact copies and modified copies, it puts on a condition about how you do so. They have to be distributed, the entirety of the work that you distribute, if it contains any of this code, it has to be under the same license. In other words, you have to respect the freedom of the next people just as we respected your freedom. So Sony was welcome to use that code if it had followed the conditions of the GNU GPL. Namely, its entire program had to be under the GNU GPL. It had to distribute a copy of the GNU GPL with the program so users would know their rights, and it had to make it available to those users the complete corresponding source code, again under the GNU GPL, so that they could change it as they wished. Sony did not do this. Thanks to a law purchased in 1996 by companies like Sony, commercial copyright infringement is a felony in the US. They could have gone to prison for years for this. But they didn't, because US officials understood quite clearly that the purpose of laws is to maintain the power of companies over the citizens. So they didn't prosecute Sony. But the victims sued Sony. However, they focused on condemning Sony's nasty methods and not its fundamentally evil goal. So Sony was able to settle the suit by promising that in the future, when it tries to take away its users' freedom and restrict them, it will not use those same methods. And Sony learned its lesson, because afterwards it came out with the PlayStation 3 with the rootkit built in before the users get it, and it was designed to be impossible to remove, and it was AACS. Although in fact, somebody figured out how to jailbreak the PlayStation 3, and Sony sent the police after them, which is why we call for a total boycott of Sony products and why we have boycott Sony stickers available up there. Well, DRM on music mostly disappeared. And now most music is being distributed over the net by with permission of the record companies without DRM. Well, okay, that's good. But DRM on music is not gone. It's coming back through streaming services like Spotify. Spotify tries to bamboozle the users because it requires the use of a proprietary client program, and that client program is missing a natural feature that would be the first thing people would add if it were free software. Namely, a button that says, save this piece in a file on disk. And Spotify says, well, no, of course it can't be saved because this is streaming. That's total nonsense. Just because it's streaming is no obstacle to saving it on disk. That would be perfectly possible. The reason that feature isn't there is because Spotify doesn't want people to have that feature. It's an intentional restriction on what people can do with the data in their own computers. It's digital restrictions management. So, out, damn Spotify. People like to believe that they don't need to possess copies of music. But that means that you are dependent on some company's server to control your access. And you only have access in the ways they choose to let you have, through the software they insist you must use. So that is not trustworthy. And worse, you may find that when a friend comes to visit, you are unable to share music with your friend because you can't get a copy. You can play it, but you can't get a copy in your computer that you could put on your friend's USB stick. Now that means you're being a bad friend. So, just because we got rid of DRM a few years ago in music doesn't mean things are safe. And now we're starting to see DRM on books as well. They tried this around 12 years ago. There was a worldwide PR campaign to convince everybody, ebooks are your future. Soon you'll be reading ebooks. And then they started making ebook players and ebooks. One publisher had the idea that it could get its line of user-restricting encrypted ebooks started with a bang among technophiles by starting with a biography of me. So the publisher found a writer who came to me and asked for my cooperation, and I said, only if this ebook is not encrypted and permits people to copy it. The publisher wouldn't accept that, and I stood firm, so that was canceled. But a few months later, we found another publisher that would agree to that. in fact, wanted to publish it on paper, but was willing to publish the source code on the net as well. In fact, it was published under a free license, the GNU Free Documentation License. So you can publish a modified version. Although it's better if you use the second edition, which was revised by me and I corrected all the errors. And it's actually a semi-autobiography because I kept all the quotes and Sam Williams's personal impressions. So now it has his point of view and my point of view for comparison. So it's a semi-autobiography. I'm not sure if there is any other semi-autobiography. And you can order it from the Free Software Foundation or read it from the source. Anyway, ebooks were a failure 10 years ago. They died in the market. And I could see, you know, it would have been really nice if people had rejected them because they took away the user's freedom. But I could see most people weren't thinking about their freedom. They were only thinking about convenience. It wasn't convenient enough. That's why it failed. So I said, they will try again. They will be back. We've got to organize now to defeat them. We can't assume that they will always lose by accident. And they're back again with products like the Sony Shredder and the Barnes & Noble Schnook and the Amazon Swindle. And once again, they're using various means to deny readers their traditional freedoms. The example I know best about is the Swindle. I call it that because it swindles readers out of their traditional freedoms. For instance, there's the freedom to acquire a book anonymously, paying cash. You can't do that with the Swindle. Books that are in print are available only from Amazon or from some other site, and in general, those sites require people to identify themselves to pay. There's no way to pay cash, which means that Amazon maintains a giant database with all the books that each user has read. The existence of such a database, no matter where it might be, is a threat to human rights. We must not tolerate it. But there is also the freedom to give the book to someone else after you read it, or sell it to a used bookstore, or lend it to your friends. Freedoms that Amazon abolishes through digital restrictions management, plus licenses that the users are required to sign, which claim that users don't own their copies. They only get permission to read under Amazon's choice of conditions. Then there's the free, and by the way, imagine what this does to society among people who read. Imagine that you go to visit your friend and there are no books. And it's not that your friend is a non-reader, but rather all her books are in this device. Well, she can't lend you her books. She'd have to lend you her whole library, and that's obviously too much to ask. You can't even browse her books and see which ones you hope to read someday. Well, again, that's killing friendship. Warn your friends in advance what it would mean if they used ebooks. Don't let them blunder into this mistake where they can't act like friends anymore. Warn them so that they avoid this mistake. But there is another freedom it takes away, the freedom to keep the book as long as you wish. Amazon abolishes that freedom with a back door. We know about this back door through observation, so we don't know everything it can do. We only know what we've seen. What we've seen is it can be used to remotely erase books. In 2009, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book. Copies which until that day were authorized copies. The users had got them from Amazon's website in the usual approved way. They were authorized copies until the day Amazon said they have to be deleted, poof. An Orwellian experience. Somebody was in my talk once who said that he was reading it while it disappeared. And can you guess which book it was? It was 1984 by George Orwell. There was a lot of criticism after that, and Amazon promised it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. If you've read 1984, that's not very comforting. Now, how might this actually happen? Let me give you an example. Several years ago, I launched a boycott of Harry Potter books, which I've since extended to the movies as well. Why? It makes logical sense. Why? It's because Rowling and her publisher went to court and got an injunction in Canada ordering the people who had bought one of her books not to read it. Here's the background. The books were shipped to bookstores with something saying, put it on sale on a certain date. Somehow this bookstore put it on sale before that date. I'm not sure whose fault it was, whether it was the bookstore or the publisher, but either way, the books were put on display. People walked into the store and said, wow, I want that. They bought it, they left. And then the bookstore discovered that this was, or someone discovered that this was not the plan, and they took the books off display, but some of them had already been sold. And this threatened to decrease Rowling's profits, which apparently are more important to her than anybody's freedom to read. So she and her publisher went to court and got this injunction. They couldn't find the people who had bought these books and take them away. They would have wanted to, but they couldn't. So all they did was order them not to read the books. So in response, I call for a boycott of Harry Potter products, but I don't say you shouldn't read those books. I leave that to the publisher and the author. I only say you shouldn't buy them or pay for them. Now, imagine that this happens in 40 years, and imagine that society has made the terrible mistake of switching to e-books that are controlled by proprietary software and that you can't buy anonymously and have this back door. Well, Rowling would have triggered the back door and erased those books. So this is a real danger. But in fact, there's a much bigger real danger. You see, these products are not designed to last a lifetime. They probably break in a year or two, and you have to buy another one. Well, Amazon has put a limit on how many different swindle products a user is allowed to transfer the book to. So in the normal course of things, those books will all disappear. So we must reject such products. In fact, it's your moral duty to reject any product that's designed to restrict your freedom unless you personally have to hand the necessary means to break the handcuffs. But that form of resistance is not enough. You see, DRM is mostly established by conspiracies of companies. It generally takes some technology companies, and maybe several of them, together with some publishers, and maybe some other companies as well, to set up the DRM scheme. And how do I know about these conspiracies? They're not secret. They have websites. You can read what these conspiracies have to say for themselves. You see, although a conspiracy of companies to restrict our technology ought to be considered a grave crime, comparable to a conspiracy to fix prices. After all, fixing prices only hurts our money, and these conspiracies hurt our freedom, which is more important than our money. But in fact, our governments are on their side against us, and they know it. They know they don't have to hide these evil conspiracies, so they boast about them. We therefore need to organize too. So the Free Software Foundation started a campaign called defectivebydesign.org. It's our campaign of protests against digital handcuffs. Please visit the site and sign up. Most of the protests are conducted in a distributed way, so you can participate from wherever you happen to be. We need to organize to fight against their organized attempts to impose restrictions on us. So this is what governments, and of course the companies that the governments serve, have done to copyright law as we move partly into the age of the computer networks. But what should governments do to copyright law? Well, they should reduce copyright power. But how? Well, first there's a dimension of time. Copyright lasts much too long. It needs to be shorter. I propose 10 years from the date of publication. Why from the date of publication rather than the date of completion of the work? Because before the work is published, we don't have copies. So it doesn't matter, it's a purely theoretical, unimportant question whether we would theoretically be allowed to do various things with the copies we don't have. We might as well let the author have as long as it takes to arrange publication of the work and then start the clock. But why 10 years? Well, in many countries, the publication cycle is 3 years. In the US, almost all books and records are remaindered within 2 years and out of print within 3. 10 years is more than 3 times the usual cycle. That ought to be plenty. So I recommend 10 years just as a cautious reduction. I'm not saying 10 years is exactly the best length. I wouldn't know. I recommend it as a first step. It'll get us somewhere in the right range. And later, after observing the results, we might make an adjustment one way or the other. Not everyone agrees with this recommendation. I recommended basically the same things as today in a panel discussion with fiction writers. And an award-winning writer said, 10 years, that's horrible. Anything more than 5 years is intolerable. Now, that surprised me too, because until that moment, the publishers had successfully misled me, as they've misled most of the public, because when they demand increased power, they always say it's on behalf of the artists. And they bring out some star artists who say, yes, I want more power too. And we're supposed to think that those star artists are representative of all the artists and they all want this power. But in fact, the same publishers that demand power in the name of the artists are grinding those artists into the ground with their heels. And this additional power doesn't help the artists in general. It helps the stars, but not the rest very much. So this author had won a prize, but his book was not a great seller, and it had gone out of print. And his fans wrote to him saying, how can I get a copy? He wanted to just send them copies. But his publisher said, you're not allowed to. We have the exclusive rights. But his contract said that when the book went out of print, the rights should revert to him. And the book appeared to be out of print. His fans said, I wrote to the author, I can't get a copy. I'm sorry, I wrote to the publisher. The publisher says I can't get a copy from them. But the publisher wouldn't admit that the book was out of print and was using the copyright on his own book to stop him from providing copies to his fans, which he wanted to do so they could read it. You see, almost every artist who publishes starts out thinking, I'd like people to look at my work and appreciate it. I'd like them to understand it, admire it, maybe criticize it a bit, but I want them to see it and appreciate it. And most of them continue wanting that. The exception being a few stars who get so much money that the money corrupts them and they start wanting money more than anything else. But most of them never get that much money, so they don't have a chance to get corrupted. They go on wanting people to appreciate their work. And that's what he wanted. And he realized that more than 5 years of copyright were not likely ever to do him any good. But they could do him harm. Well, as I said, I don't insist on 10 years. If everyone else wants 5 years, I could live with that. But what about the other question, the breadth of copyright? Which uses of copyrighted work should be permitted? For this, I distinguish 3 different categories of works based on the kind of contribution they make to society. Now, this is not a value judgment about which contribution is more or less important. They're different in nature. So, first, there are the works that are meant to be used to do practical jobs. You could call them functional works, but this doesn't mean there is no aesthetic aspect to them at all. It means rather that their purpose is to have a function. You use them to do a job. Second, there are works that state what certain people think or want or saw, which you might call works of testimony. And then there are works of art and entertainment, whose contribution is in the impact that the work makes on a person who observes it. So these are 3 different ways of a work can contribute to society. And I have different recommendations about them. First, let's look at the works of practical use. These include computer programs, recipes for cooking, educational works. These include also reference works, text fonts, and various other things. These works must be free. The same reason that applies to software applies to the other works of practical use. The people who are using the work must have control over what they're doing. That's what freedom is. It's having control over your own life, over your own activities. So if you're doing an activity using a work, you've got to have control over that work. And this leads to the same conclusion that it leads to with software. The same 4 freedoms. People have got to be free to use the work as they wish. They've got to be free to change it so it does different things the way they wish. And once they've done so, they've got to be free to publish their modified versions, because those might be useful for somebody else who wants to do that kind of job. But once you permit publishing modified versions, it's ridiculous to try to stop people from republishing without changes, because that would just push them to make some insignificant changes that don't alter the result. So you end up with the same 4 freedoms. But someone might forecast the end of the world. He might say, if users are free with these works, if these works are free, then no one will ever write anything and it'll be a disaster. Well, now we already know that this is not true from just experience. We just empirically look at the free software movement. tens of thousands of useful free programs that we've developed. Some of the developers get paid, and many of them are volunteers. Either way, the works exist. Then look at all the recipes that circulate, and all the users treat them as free, and yet cookbooks are still published. Then look at reference works such as Wikipedia that are free. And there are even starting to be free textbooks, although a large amount of academia has made a terrible mistake. It just took the wrong turn. It talks about open educational resources, and in this case, open is an excuse to make them non-free. They're released under a license which isn't a free license. It's Creative Commons non-commercial share alike. That's not a free license, because if a work's use is limited to non-commercially, that's not free. Well, they've made a mistake. It was started by somebody with good intentions, Professor Abelson, and he made this compromise which had the bad characteristic that it's hard to fix it later. You know, there's some mistakes where the more people go down the wrong road, the harder it is to get them over to the right one. And this seems to be of that kind. So anyway, that's the issue of the works for practical use. What about the works that state what certain people thought? Well, for these works, publishing a modified version seems like misrepresenting someone else. Therefore, maybe there's no reason to allow that. And if you don't allow publishing a modified version, there's no reason to allow commercial republication even of unmodified copies. But there is one minimum freedom that people must have, and that's the freedom to non-commercially redistribute exact copies. In other words, the freedom to share. I use the term sharing to mean non-commercial redistribution of exact copies of a work. So, I don't say that the works in the second category have to be free, but I do say they must be shareable, which is just a part of freedom too. So, we could have a partly modified copyright system that covers all commercial use and all modification. But non-commercial redistribution of exact copies, that must be legalized. In other words, we must end the war on sharing. Now look how cruel the war on sharing has got. The nastiest thing that they're doing in Europe is they're taking down websites without a trial. They're blocking access to websites. In some countries, this is done without a trial. They punish people with disconnection from the internet without a trial. In other words, they're attacking basic principles of justice. But in Japan, we can see how far they want to go. In Japan, downloading an unauthorized copy is punished by 2 years imprisonment. Uploading an unauthorized copy is punished by 5 years imprisonment. Now, this is more than most thieves and rapists get sentenced to, in fact. So, this is just oppression. We must legalize sharing so that we end the war on sharing, because the war on sharing is what makes copyright intolerable today. By legalizing sharing, we can turn copyright back into an industrial regulation we can live with. So we must do that. However, one of the kinds of works that say what certain people think are scientific papers. A scientific paper is a work of testimony. The names of the authors are very important, because those are the people whose reputation is on the line if their work is wrong. And it's absolutely crucial to have people's names on there who are responsible for the work. And so my recommendation has generally been allow sharing, or maybe even allow commercial redistribution, since after all the authors are not getting paid anyway, in this case. But Michael Eisen, who started the Public Library of Science, said to me he thinks more is needed, that there are useful ways of doing things to scientific papers that contribute to science. So he says there's got to be more freedom. You've got to be freedom to crunch these papers in various ways. So it seems that maybe scientific papers also need to be free. In practice, how do we bring that about? In scientific publishing, there are the journals that publish restricted access journals that charge an arm and a leg for being able to read them. And then there are the journals that allow non-restricted access and also mostly permit other kinds of use of the papers. And these often charge the authors for publishing because they have an editor. The editor needs to be paid. How do you pay the editor? That's the conundrum, or the supposed problem, because the solutions are easy enough. It's not as if it were an unsolved problem, it's just a problem. Well, the restrictive journals say, we restrict everybody in order to pay the editors. Of course, the profits are much more than what the editors get, but that doesn't matter. However, the non-restrictive journals, they typically charge the authors of the papers. But there's a third method that could be used. Governments could simply provide grants to pay the editor. So that's a fine solution too, but in any case, charging the authors works. Now, most authors are getting research funds which they can use to pay to publish their papers. And in fact, it's the same funding agencies that would pay either way. Either on top of each research grant, they pay overhead. This is a fact. But what's the overhead go for? Part of it goes to fund the university library to pay for the expensive subscriptions to these journals. The alternative is, on top of the research grant, they could include some money to pay for publication of the results. They'll be paying less if they do it this way because it gets rid of a lot of the inefficiency of the system. And one way or the other, they're still going to be paying the same editors to do the same editing. So they might as well switch over to this system, give the extra money to the researchers so that they can pay the journal to publish their papers. And when once in a while there's an author who has no research funding, the journal could make an exception for them. The journal could say, we won't charge those authors, we'll divide that part of the cost among the other authors who do have funds. So Eisen recommends publishing scientific papers under Creative Commons attribution, which permits everything basically, except they have to give credit to the author of the original, and I think they have to say that they've changed it if they've changed it. But what about the third category, works of art and entertainment? In this category, the question of modification was difficult for me because I saw valid arguments on both sides. On the one hand, an artistic work can have an artistic integrity, and modifying it can destroy that integrity. As proof of this, look at the way Hollywood butchers most of the books it turns into movies. Except that in that case, the authors gave permission, so I guess they didn't have much artistic integrity. But there are a few authors that insist on not butchering their works, that the movie has to be faithful to the work, and I guess they do have artistic integrity. In any case, this is a real issue. On the other hand, though, there are many arguments in favor of modified versions of artistic work. A modified version can be a contribution to art. Consider, for instance, the folk process, whereby a work can be transformed by a series of artists, and this can produce something very rich. But if we want to consider known, identified artists, consider Shakespeare. Some of Shakespeare's plays borrowed stories from other works published a few decades before. If today's copyright law had been in effect then, those plays of Shakespeare would have been infringing, and of course, they wouldn't have been written. And if Shakespeare or the Earl of Oxford or Henry Neville or whoever it was that wrote them had complained about this, the copyright holders would have said, he just wants to make a rip-off of my great work. And since this so-called rip-off would never have been written, we wouldn't be able to judge whether that was true. And we might naively take for granted that it's true. But since those plays were written, we can say that they're important contributions to human literature. And meanwhile, since Shakespeare's works are in the public domain, there have been adaptations which are also very interesting, works that are somehow based partly on some part of Shakespeare, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is basically situated within the story of Hamlet. So we can see that modified versions of artistic works can be contributions to art. Well, eventually I saw a way to resolve this problem. If you had to wait up to 10 years before you publish your modified version, it would be no disaster. So what I recommend is, for 10 years, this modified, partly reduced copyright system that covers all commercial use and all modification, but everybody's free to share. Then the work goes into the public domain, and people could publish their modified versions. So that's what I recommend in terms of reforming copyright law, but there's one other question, that's remix. Remix means taking pieces of various works and putting them together, maybe with some new stuff, and making something that's fundamentally different from whatever works you used pieces of. And since the purpose of copyright is to encourage making more works, remix must be legal. It's perverse for copyright to be an obstacle to remix. So sharing should be legal and copyright should be shortened, and the works for practical uses should be free. Now, legalizing sharing includes legalizing peer-to-peer sharing over the internet, as well as sharing in your house. The publishers would say the sky will fall. For instance, the record companies will say that's stealing from the musicians. Nonsense. The record companies took everything from the musicians already. There's nothing left for us to take anyway. I just read that the record companies, until a few years ago, used to print and sell lots of records that they wouldn't tell the musicians had even been sold, so as to cheat them, systematically cheating them. But even when they followed the contract, they were still cheating the musicians in spirit, because, well, in fact, when I buy a commercial CD, I feel ashamed because I know that I'm not supporting the musicians. How is that? Well, theoretically, if this is the price that you pay, some fraction is for the musicians. In practice, they never get it, because the production and publicity expenses are treated as an advance to the musicians, which has to be paid back by this share. So the share that's nominally for the musicians really just goes from one account in the record company to another account in the record company. It's very rare that any record sells enough copies to finish repaying this so-called advance and actually start providing any money to musicians. So how do musicians actually make money? Well, if they are long-established superstars, they came to the end of their first contract. And then, being stars, they were able to get another contract which actually didn't exploit them. And if you buy their later records, they actually get money. But if you buy their earlier records, they don't get any money, because those are still under the old contract. But still, aside from that, how do musicians get money? Through their concerts, and by selling stuff at their concerts, and sometimes by donations. Some musicians are actually getting enough to support them through donations from their fans, which they have websites where they ask for donations, and they will, if you give a big enough donation, they'll offer you something symbolically in exchange. And it works. But anyway, this does not mean musicians get no benefit from a record contract. The benefit that they get is being better known. So they have more concerts, more people come to their concerts, and that's good for them. But there are other ways to publicize music which are healthier, because the hype industrial complex does not get involved. So let's kick out the record companies. The fact is, we should give the major record companies what they deserve. And what they deserve is to lose everything, because these are the companies that have purchased unjust and cruel laws to attack our freedom. These are the companies that have sued teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars because they shared. These companies deserve as much of a punishment as we can come up with. They deserve the corporate death penalty. After all, they're not people. So, we should always keep in mind in these discussions what those companies really deserve. But, so, there's no real problem, therefore, if we legalize sharing music. What about movies? You've heard giant figures for what it costs to make a movie. Well, they're not entirely true. A producer told me more than half of those figures is publicity, not actually making the movie. Okay, so it's less. But what about that figure? That's not honest either, because they generally use phony accounting tricks to exaggerate it. And the real cost of making the movie is much less than they said. Put that on one side. On the other side, there's the fact that lots of use of movies is commercial use, and under my proposal, that would be covered by copyright, just as it is now. So they would get in lots of money. Put those two together, and they could still keep making movies. But what if Hollywood couldn't make movies? Because outside of Hollywood and a few other such things like Bollywood, movies are very often subsidized by governments, which is not necessarily bad. Maybe they make better movies that way, because the fact is Hollywood systematically makes trash. Now, this is a strong statement. I didn't just say Hollywood usually makes trash. I say systematically. There's a system at work here. I learned about this system in a book called Save the Cat, whose stated purpose is to teach people how to write screenplays and sell them to Hollywood. But in order to do this, it had to explain the system that was at work. Now, I had no interest in writing screenplays. I probably have no such talent anyway. But I was interested in seeing how the system worked, which is why I kept reading the book. And it explains the system that causes most Hollywood movies to be trash. It's not that it's just so hard to make a good movie that they keep trying and failing. No, they're following a pathway set up by the system, and that pathway leads to trash almost all the time. Well, that doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. I'm against censorship, period. Censorship is terribly dangerous. And I certainly do not advocate censoring something just because I think it's trash. But that's not the question here. The question here is, should we give up our freedom to help them keep doing it? And there the answer is no. We shouldn't give up our freedom so they can keep making trash. However, if we appreciate the arts, we should want to support artists. After all, artists make the art, and they won't do it if they have to be working doing something else. So it's good if artists can avoid a day job once they get good enough to be worthy of our concern about whether they can do art. So it's good to support artists. The current system does a lousy job of it. I've proposed two systems which do a better job and are compatible with legalizing sharing. Here they are. The first approach works using tax money. Either you take part of the general public budget, or you put a special tax on internet connectivity or something like that to collect money to use. One way or the other, you've got some money to distribute among the artists. Now, the copyright system supposedly supports them based on how popular they are. Let's keep that idea. My proposal also supports them based on how popular they are. So we can measure the popularity of the artists either by some kind of polling system or by measuring how often their works are shared in peer-to-peer networks, and maybe other ways as well, because we shouldn't do it by surveillance of everybody's use of art. That would be an injustice. But we can do it without the injustice. So we measure every artist's popularity, we get these popularity figures. Then how does that determine how much money each artist gets? The obvious way is linear proportion. If A is twice as popular as B, A gets twice as much money as B. And if A is a star and is 1,000 times as popular as a pretty good and fairly popular artist B, then A would get 1,000 times as much money, and this means the money's being used inefficiently, because most of the total money would be divided among a fairly small number of stars who don't need any more anyway, and the amount of this total that's available to support the artists in the middle range who could really use some help would be a small fraction of it. So this would be inefficient use of our money. To make it efficient, I propose to take the cube root of each artist's popularity. Now, the cube root of 1,000 is 10. So if A, the star, is 1,000 times as popular as fairly popular good artist B, A would get 10 times as much money as B. Not 1,000 times, but just 10. This has the effect of shifting most of the money from the stars to the middle success level of artists, the ones the supporting of whom would really help support the arts. So this way, yes, the more popular that you are, the more money you get, but you don't get enormously more, so that most of the money efficiently supports the arts. This is one system. The other works through voluntary payment. Suppose each player has a button, and you can push it and it will send €1 to the artists. And you can push it if you want to. You don't have to. Nothing tries to force you or pressure you. But if you do it, you'll feel good. So lots of people will do it. And some people won't. There are poor people who really can't afford to give €1 to some artists, and they won't. And that's good. We shouldn't squeeze money out of poor people to support the arts. Instead, we should invite those who are not poor, and there are plenty of those, to support the arts. And if they don't send as much as we wish they would, we could have a friendly PR campaign. Instead of today's PR campaigns that say, if you share, that you're a thief, you're a pirate, sharing is evil, don't help anybody, we could have a kind PR campaign. Did you send €1 to some artist today? Why not? It's just €1. You'll never miss it. And you'll feel happy if you support them. If you liked it, once in a while, send them something. So, I'd like to mention, for more information about free software and GNU, take a look at gnu.org. There is also the Free Software Foundation, which we set up to promote software users' freedom, including our campaign against digital restrictions management, which is at defectivebydesign.org. You should visit that and sign up, but you can also become a member of the FSF. You can do that through the site fsf.org, or if you want to pay your dues in cash, you can do it today. I have cards you can fill out. There is also the Free Software Foundation Europe, which you can find at fsfe.org, and they have people with a table outside. Maybe you can pay your dues in cash to join that organization too. Can they? Is someone from FSF Europe in here? They can't do that? Too bad. So you have to join through fsfe.org. In any case, here is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction this on behalf of the Free Software Foundation. And if you are the purchaser, I can sign this card or the tag. And if you have a penguin at home, you need to get a GNU for your penguin. Because, as we all know, a penguin can't hardly function without a GNU. We can accept payment either in cash or with a credit card. If the credit card works for international purchases by phone, it will work for us. And when you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount, because you want me to notice, right? I'm a bit hard of hearing, so shout it clearly like this. So I'm going to start with €20, which is its normal price. Do I get €20? How much? Okay, I got 25. Do I get 30? Which of you spoke first? Okay, I've got 35. I've got 35. Do I get 40? How much? I've got 40. Do I get 45? I've got 45. Do I get 50? I've got 45. Do I get 50? You offer 100. Okay, I've got 100. Do I get 110? I've got 100. Do I get 110? Do I get 110? Do I get €110 for this adorable GNU that needs a home? Do I get 110? Do I get €110? I've got 110. Do I get 120? Do I get 120? I've got 110. Do I get 120? Do I get €120? I've got 150. I've got 150. Do I get 160? I've got 150. Do I get 160? €160 for this adorable GNU that needs a home. Do I get 160 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom? Do I get 160? 160 euros? Last chance. Do I get 160 or more? Last chance. Going. Gone for 150. Please come. Thank you. I'll sign it towards later after the questions. And now it is time for questions. So I am somewhat hard of hearing.
Wave your hands.
If you want them to ask with the microphone, here's a point.
Okay.
It's more efficient to keep the microphone here and have people queue up to ask the questions rather than carrying the microphone around the hall. And also another advantage of using the queuing method is it's totally fair. When you get on the queue, you'll get to the front and you'll have your turn. You're not dependent on some arbitrary order of recognizing you. So it's a very good system. Anyway, you might as well ask now.
Right,
Please
okay.
ask.
I'm Lars. I work across the street at
I'm
ESO.
sorry, I can't hear you. You're speaking too fast. I am
sorry.
hard of hearing.
Okay.
I have trouble recognizing consonants.
My name is Lars. I work across the road at ESO, where I get paid to write software that we distribute to the public under the GPL.
Thank you.
So thank
Great.
you. Thank you for writing the GPL. Now you probably know that here in Germany we actually have a political.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear all that. Yeah, I need to hear every consonant, so you've got to say them slowly.
Right. So you probably know that here in Germany we have a political party whose pretty much only goal is the reform of copyright law.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I read their platform, and
Right.
they have other goals too.
Well, okay, they. Patents and trademarks.
No, they have other goals too.
Okay. So what I wanted to ask you is, what would you want this political party to strive for if you had influence?
Well, I read their program, and I mostly agreed with it. I don't, unfortunately, remember the points I disagreed with, but overall it was pretty good. I wish they would push more for free software. But, you know, even if they don't do that, it can still be good. If they're interested in my comments, they should write to me. I'll read the platform again. It was actually, I think it was the Slovenian Pirate Party that asked me for advice and said they had started with the German Pirate Party's program, and so I gave them the advice because they asked for it. But, okay.
Thanks.
Now, it's very important to reject the propaganda term pirate. Don't call people who share pirates. Now, what the Pirate Party is trying to do is take this insult and turn it into a badge of resistance. Well, I understand that approach, and sometimes you can make that work. For instance, you might have heard the word Yankee. Well, during the American Revolution, the British called the rebels Yankees, so they adopted that term for themselves. So I guess you can do it with pirates too, and I won't criticize that, but aside from that, don't ever use the term pirate or piracy to describe sharing.
Okay, thank you for your amazing talk, Mr. Stallman. My question concerns what Cory Doctorow said last December when he spoke at the Chaos Communication Congress in Berlin, and he talked about what he called the war on general computation. Is the mic? Should I speak louder? Okay. So his theory is that the copyright war is just the beginning, that it's going to be just a small skirmish and part of a much broader picture on general purpose computers and general purpose networks. For example, he says that in the future the government may try to restrict your 3D printer so that it doesn't print knives, or the insurance companies might try to enforce a certain firmware on your self-driving car. And or surveillance states like the United States might impose a certain operating system on a computer and a check for assigned firmware, so you can't
well,
use a free
Microsoft's already doing that.
Yeah, but it might be actually enforced by the government so that there's spyware on your computer.
There may be no difference between the government and Microsoft. You know, with the empire of the mega corporations, we have governments like the US government that mainly works for the companies to carry out what they want.
That's right, but the question is,
but the thing is,
not
Apple's
about
worse than Microsoft, so the biggest danger is in 20 years the US government might be doing what Apple tells it to do. Ugh.
My point is, and this is what Cory Doctorow's theory was, that this is not about copyright. No one cares about copyright. They care about controlling people. And so it's...
Well, I think he's partly right and partly wrong. It's not true that nobody cares about copyright. There are many copyright companies, publishers of various things, that care very much about copyright and lobby very effectively and get unjust laws to punish people. So that part's not true. But it is true that there are other companies like Apple and Microsoft, following Apple's example, that want more control over people. And they're trying to do this by having control over people's computers. We're going to have to fight, indeed, against that attack on our freedom. You shouldn't buy tyrant devices. And now, I refuse to have a computer with non-free software in it. I won't use a smartphone because of that, and I won't use a non-smartphone because that's also a computer with software that somebody else can change. They just won't let me change it at all. The phone company can install software into that, and they can install malicious software into that, and they do. But at the very least, get a model that isn't a tyrant.
Hi. So you talked about we should, well, effectively kill those big publishers which try to take away our freedom, for example, Hollywood, and I completely agree. Now, there is one great thing. They gave us, at least Hollywood, gave us the weapons for that.
Gave us what?
The weapons for doing this, actually.
Maybe. I
Yes,
don't know.
they
I don't
did.
follow. How?
I will explain. So they, in order to reduce their costs and to increase their control over content, so they implemented their digital cinema initiative. And because they wanted to avoid the patent wars, all the parts of digital cinema are patent-free. It uses the JPEG 2000 codec, not the bit streams. The codec itself is patent-free. All the metadata is contained in XML, and it uses AES encryption. So what
now, I don't know all the details of this, but could you email me information about this format?
What I did during the last 2 years is implementing a free toolchain. It's under the GPL to create digital cinema packages which you can distribute to the cinemas. And it's not yet feature complete, but it will be extended with an online refund system similar to Flutter, so that...
It sounds very good.
Yes.
Can you also use it to play the movie on your computer?
In theory, yes. The problem is that the JPEG 2000 codec is so slow that right now you need dedicated hardware to decode it in real time.
I see.
The other problem is the key distribution mechanisms used right now is effectively OpenSSL. So it's secure
Well, I
in
guess
theory.
why do you need key distribution if you're not practicing DRM? Hollywood practices DRM.
I'm not. But
Okay.
the publishers try to enforce cinemas that they can play the movies only at given time. So
Right, I understand the point, but you don't want to do that.
no, I don't use it.
So we don't need to worry about the key distribution.
Yes, and now
The point is,
independent filmmakers can now distribute their works worldwide by just distributing. And here's the caveat: standard movie takes about 90 minutes, take about 200 gigabytes. So it's mostly a bandwidth problem.
I
But
see.
other than that, you can now bring your movie for only the cost of pushing out the data into the cinema. And the tool chain is on my homepage. I have also all the source codes on GitHub. So
okay,
it's not
GitHub
feature
is
complete.
not a good choice of platform because
It's just one
it's
copy.
not very good to the users.
There are several copies.
I recommend you pick, say, if you want to use Git, use Gitorious, not GitHub.
It's also on Gitorious.
Okay, then tell people Gitorious, not GitHub.
Okay, yes.
In any case, which version of the GPL did you use?
I did use the GPL version 3 because there are no patented technologies in it. It's patent free.
Okay, sorry, you did use GPL version 3 or you didn't?
I did.
Good. But did you say GPL version 3 or later?
I don't know.
Please check that.
I think it's only version 3.
See, if you use only version 3, well, at the moment, there's no problem. We don't have a GPL version 4, and I hope that for many years we won't have one. But nothing's perfect. We might need to make a GPL version 4 someday. And if that happens and you used only GPL version 3, the result could be that your code won't be combinable with future programs under GPL version 4. So it's really important to do GPL version 3 or later.
Okay, I will add this in the next version.
Okay, hi. I want to elaborate, or I'd like you to elaborate on a point you made earlier, because I think that all hardware should be free if software is free.
Well, as I pointed out, at the moment, it's meaningless to ask whether hardware is free.
Exactly, that's a problem I see, because this is basically the same thing we did with, that you described with the printing presses, that we traded off theoretical freedom for convenience, or for
Right.
things that we didn't
The
think
thing
of.
is, this becomes a real issue when we have the ability to copy. In fact, for the most part, nobody's trying to stop us from copying physical objects. They're not copyrightable.
Yes.
The only things that might stop that, or that might forbid that, is, well, patent law, and in some cases the visible, unimportant details might be a trademark. But I don't think that would matter if you're copying it privately, non-commercially. The trademarks wouldn't be relevant anyway. So basically, what we need to do is the 3D printer community needs to, by the way, who is the person who was going to sell the stuff in here or out there? What? He's out there. Good, thanks. So you can buy FSF gear outside and support our work. You could also read the book. Anyway, in the 3D printing community, the maker community, they should adopt license standards now. They have the opportunity to do this right or make a mistake. So they should say, we will not publish a design for a utilitarian object unless the design is under a free license. And even better, they could say it has to be compatible with GPL 3 or later. Various different licenses with different levels of freedom protection are compatible with GPL version 3. So they could do that. And with decorative objects, which don't do any job, they just look nice, They could say the designs must be shareable at least, or we won't publish them. They shouldn't let people use their sites to publish designs that restrict people unjustly.
Okay, but I think this is going to be the smallest amount of designs that are going to be in existence. The podium you mentioned has probably some
But the point is, it doesn't
CNC
have
schematics.
Well, who
somewhere
knows? There's a way people make them, but it may not have a design in the
Okay.
sense that you are thinking of. It probably doesn't have a design set up such that you could put it into a 3D printer at all.
Or at the CNC device at the local hacker.
Who knows?
hacker
I mean,
things.
you
It
could
might be available.
With 3D printers, there are also 3D scanners. And the main way you would make a pseudopodium is by scanning one. And, you know, and of course, that can be done. So I don't think I don't think we need to worry about about the physical objects that are made that we can't make
Okay.
from designs.
Okay, I just saw somewhat of an historical parallel that I thought it might
I
be
don't think it's really parallel, though.
Okay. Well,
I think we should be aware now that when something can be made with a 3D printer or some other personal fabrication technology, the designs must give the appropriate freedoms.
Okay. I was wondering if you could comment on a recent experience that I had with academic publication. So I recently had a paper accepted at a conference whose proceedings are published by the ACM.
Yeah, the ACM is very bad.
Yeah. So, of course, when the final copy was due, they expect you to put an ACM copyright notice on your own paper, and also to assign the copyright to the ACM. But instead of doing that, I sent the paper along with a public domain declaration. I figured that that would allow them to publish the work and sell it however they wanted to. However, I just found out this morning that according to their publication policy, my paper will not be appearing in the proceedings.
Well, good on you.
Yeah. So,
But the thing is, you need to, the community needs to organize. Someone proposed that there could be a strike against an ACM conference where all the authors, or many of them, at the last minute refuse to assign copyright, and they either have to cancel the conference because they have no papers to publish, or you can, or they will have to give in. Now, what you can do is publish your paper yourself and say, this was accepted by the ACM conference and such, except that because I wouldn't assign copyright, they ultimately refused to publish it.
right. I actually plan to do that in the future, but...
You could do it now.
I will. So, fortunately, the conference organizers, the conference chair and also a member of the steering committee, they emailed the representative at the ACM. They said that I will still be allowed to present my work at the conference, which is good because that's one of the reasons that I submitted it in the first place. Mm-hmm. I want to share my work. But they also, in their emails to the ACM, hinted that perhaps the ACM should reconsider their publication policy.
Good. Well, this is pressure in the right direction. You have achieved something noteworthy. And be sure to talk about it when you present your paper, too.
All right.
Or hand out pieces of paper explaining this part. You know, I had a discussion about this something like 15 years ago with the then president of the ACM. And the answer I got when I criticized this was, we need to restrict access to these papers to pay for our digital library server. And I said, well, if you didn't restrict access, you wouldn't need a special server for this. The only reason you need a powerful server is that everybody has to get it from you. If you allowed redistribution, then copies would be available in lots of places from mirrors, and your server wouldn't have to be anything more than an ordinary PC. So this is a good example of how the solution to a problem keeps the problem going.
Yeah. I have to say, I do appreciate your advocacy of freedom very much, but there is one thing that struck me, namely your approach towards governments, your trust in governments expressed seemingly by your proposition for introducing new taxes, etc. How is this to be unified with the concept of freedom?
Well, there's no contradiction between taxes and freedom.
What about new taxes?
Not at all. There's nothing wrong
giving...
with there's nothing wrong with new taxes. It's just a question of how much are we paying and what do we achieve with it. Now, taxes, new taxes, or cuts in benefits to support the banksters, that's very bad. Tax cuts can be horrible if they're tax cuts on the rich, as in the US, that's what they do. Whenever the politicians in the US keep making tax cuts for the rich, and then they say, now we have a budget deficit because of the tax cut we gave the rich, so we're going to have to cut all these important programs that help ordinary people. So I'm not against government programs. I'm for democracy and using tax money to do things that help people in general, and not directing society's efforts to make the rich richer.
Yeah, this might be quite fine in specific contexts, but I had the impression that you were quite skeptical and quite, one could say, afraid of giving more powers to big corporations.
Oh, well, yes, but this doesn't give power to the corporations. This takes it away from them.
How about giving a lot of power to governments?
Well,
is this that much different?
This particular power doesn't seem dangerous. I'll tell you what powers are dangerous when governments have them. Surveillance power. That's what's dangerous. And the powers that they create for the war on sharing, those are dangerous. So we've got, it's a mistake to say government is bad. That's a foolish idea. Governments can do good or bad. The only way we can resist the power of the rich is with democratic government. That's what democracy is. It means that the many get together, and together they are stronger than the rich. That form of government is the only way we can stop rich people from taking everything and making our lives into suffering. We've got to use it. So it's a mistake to say government is bad as a generalization. Government can be bad, and when government is not democratic, it tends to be bad. But don't reject democratic government based on the idea that government is always bad.
Yeah, it's all fine.
Now, basically, I'm not an anarchist because I have a prostate gland.
Yep, neither am I.
They're finally getting it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Are there no more questions?
Oh, you're sitting down.
Okay. I usually like free software, and I agree with most of the ideas, but I have the feeling, or at least it's my impression, that proprietary companies such as Microsoft have helped promote the existence of, or have helped make computers more available to the public.
So what?
So what do you think about that?
Maybe you're right, but I think that's unimportant. It's not good to spread the use of computers if those computers are user subjugating. So there is no virtue in spreading the use of digital technology unless it's freedom-respecting technology. We've got to reject the goals that disregard ethical political issues.
Good afternoon. So my topic will be UEFI, the new booting system that involves keys. I would like to have a comment from you about this new technology and how do you plan to fight it, or if you have plans to fight it.
First of all, UEFI does basically the same job as a BIOS. It replaces a BIOS and does the same job. So one of the features that it has is called secure boot. And that means that the user can put some keys into the machine and then it will refuse to run a system or other parts, other BIOS, other EFI add-ons, unless they're signed with that key. As long as this is under the user's control, then it's a security measure, and it's nothing wrong with it. However, Microsoft is trying to convert this secure boot into restricted boot. Microsoft wants computers to be shipped with Microsoft's key and no way to replace it. So that way, those computers will only run programs approved by Microsoft.
Yes.
And that makes them tyrant devices, and that's why we call it restricted boot. So the Free Software Foundation has a campaign against restricted boot, basically telling Microsoft to take its boot off our necks. And I think restricted boot should be made illegal if it isn't illegal already.
Okay.
And it would be good to campaign. It would be good to campaign for this in one European country or even a region, if a region can make this kind of law, to ban the sale of restricted boot computers.
Okay. Thanks for the answer.
Hello, Mr. Stallman. First off, I want to thank you very much that you're here today, and I think on behalf of all of us. I really love the idea of free software, and I've seen it spread very widely in a certain community on the internet, especially with remixes, because they're doing it for free and other people are giving money and to spread the word. And I want to ask about one point you talked about but didn't dive into more, about the tools you want to be free. Because I'm working for a programmer right now, and he's doing a tool, basically a program so people can present songs on a projector. And he's selling these copies for maybe $100, and he's doing it as commercial software. And
well, the important point is it proprietary, non-free software? Because commercial just means it's a business. That's neither good nor bad. That's just a side issue. But it sounds like he's making it non-free. Is that correct?
It's non-free. And
well,
my question is, I know. My question is, how can he distribute the software? And it's not many people want them. It's like a few churches or other.
Well, then he should do something like ask them to please donate to the project or something like that. But the crucial point is, let's suppose there's no way he can bring in money making it free software. What would follow? Would that be an excuse to make non-free software? Absolutely not. If you have the choice to write a non-free program or do nothing at all, you should do nothing at all, because that's not doing harm. Developing non-free software is subjugating people. That's wrong. It's an injustice. It should not exist, and it's not excusable.
So how about distributing the source code, and so users can compile it for themselves?
If it's not free software with the 4 freedoms, then it's not ethical. That's my position. So if you propose things where they get part of the freedom, the users get only part of the necessary freedom, it's not adequate, because In order for the users to control the program, both individually and collectively, they need the 4 freedoms. There's a reason why these 4 freedoms are essential.
Thank you.
Hello. I really liked your idea of that art tax, where the government does give the money to the artists, and for example, it's measured how often a piece of music is listened somewhere by somebody.
Well, not listened. You see, if they measured listening to it, that would be surveillance of people, and that would be unacceptable.
Yes.
But if they count how often it's being shared through peer-to-peer networks, see, after all, the peer-to-peer networks are a public activity, so anybody can count that.
Exactly, that was my question. How could you think of building a system which does not allow abuse of that system? For example, an artist could write a program to share his own music around the internet to get more money out of it.
Well, an artist might conceivably convince a lot of people to download her work, and that would of course inflate the figures, but is that dishonest? Maybe not. Maybe that's honest. After all, if all these people are downloading that artist's work to express that they like that work, well, maybe that is popularity. So I'm not sure that's even dishonest.
No, I mean that it's not true popularity.
But how, I'm sorry, how would he be doing this? Would he use a botnet?
For example,
Well,
something like that.
the thing is, a botnet is a crime anyway.
But how could you detect such abuse of the system, and wouldn't that restrict the
Oh, I
users'
think that they
freedom?
probably could. So I think that the problem of botnets is probably going to get more or less solved anyway. So, but in any case, zombie machines can get detected, and so they could tell perhaps whether the sharing is going on by zombies. In any case, I don't think very many artists are going to make contracts with the kind of people that manage botnets. They probably don't even know where to find somebody who runs a botnet. Would you be able to find somebody who runs a botnet? I wouldn't know how.
To find, I guess, yes. Okay, thanks.
So,
excuse me, I really was late when I bid. Can I ask you to please sign it now so I can leave?
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Well, I think we're done.
Okay, thank you all for coming.
But if you buy the book, I'll sign that too. Or a shirt if you want, I'll sign those.
He said he was done, so I think if you have more questions, you have to try to find him in private afterwards.
Over there, okay. I can't hear you at all. So, what's your name?
Lars.
Lars, okay, so